First of all, I want to say hi to you. And this is Chuck Rhein with Calvary Chapel St. Joe. And just excited that you're going to take time to watch this. We figure here at Calvary that a lot of people are having more time to read the Bible, more time hopefully to pray, more family time. And this is intended to encourage you to break open books of the Bible that maybe you don't know that well, and it's going to be short and sweet. And so I wanted to share with you out of the book of Genesis, my favorite section, chapter 50, dealing with Joseph. And the title to this is How to Not Be a Slave to Another Person's Sin. And for those of you familiar with the story of Joseph, you know that his brothers sold him into slavery, into a pagan nation, which would have been an Old Testament death sentence. They were jealous of him, and we see elements of personal favoritism with his dad, with Jacob. And what really blows my mind about Joseph and about this section of scripture kind of correlates with what we have during this worldwide pandemic, in that Joseph had a lot of time to think, and that can be hard for us. And so if you know that Joseph was sold into slavery, that would have been a time where both the book of Hebrews and the book of Deuteronomy describe what's called a root of bitterness. And I can imagine if it was you or I in that situation, thinking through, wow, how could my brothers do this to me? How could the people that are supposed to love me allow me to be possibly killed in this situation? How could they not do a different form of, discipline with me? And how about the why questions that so frequently enter into our lives? And so in Genesis 50, verse 20, what has happened is that Jacob has died, and his brothers are concerned that because Joseph is second in charge of all of Egypt, because he's in a powerful position, that now that his dad has passed, that he can take vengeance on his brothers. And that's what the flesh would do. That's what, in this world, you watch a movie and you see the bad guys get it in the end, and we cheer and we root for those people, but I don't know that God does that. And they're worried that with the passing of their father, that Joseph is going to now lay into consequences for their evil. And so in verse 20 of Genesis 50, Joseph says, regarding to what they did to him, he says, "But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive." Verse 21, "Now therefore do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones and your kids." And he comforted them, and he spoke kindly to them. What strikes me right off the bat about Joseph and his perspective and his godly character, because there's nothing negative written about Joseph. There's no sin ascribed to him in the Bible. And so first off, what I want to point out is that God is omnipresent. I've thought about why or how is Joseph this kind of a man of God? And I think if you go back to chapter 39, verse 9, there's an opportunity for sin where Joseph could have biblical relations with Potiphar's wife. But what he says in Genesis 39:9 is, how can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? And so one of the secrets I see with Joseph is that he has the awareness that God is everywhere. In every dark nook and cranny in life, there isn't any place that escapes the presence of God. He had that awareness. And King David wrote in Psalm 139:9 that if I ascend into heaven, you are there. And if I make my bed in hell or Sheol, you are there. And so God is made in his presence known with Joseph no matter where he goes. and he realizes to sin is to sin against God. Number two, what we see in this passage is that God uses evil that man commits against us. And in the words of Joseph, he uses man's evil to save many people. And that's a real disconnect for us, especially as Christians. If you've got another believer, another Christian that sins against you or I, or even in our family, think about how difficult injustices that have been done to us are to overcome. And Joseph, through God's wisdom, is able to recognize that God is able to work this together for good. And I just want to encourage you to know that this world, this pandemic-filled, uncertain, according to the world's standards right now, is not our home. And that for us to believe in Jesus Christ and to have our trust and our rest in him is to realize that this is temporary, that we have heaven to look forward to, and that God will use evil that man commits against us. And so that links into point number 3. When we read in Romans 8:28 that all things work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his Spirit, we need to realize that that is not necessarily for the good of man's flesh. And it doesn't mean that you or I are going to like necessarily how things work together for good. In fact, there might be seasons, and you may be at this season in your life right now, where God is working together things for good, kind of like with Jonah when he gave his message to Nineveh. We may not like that, but we can still be a part of God using that evil for good. And that's an amazing character trait, because then what we see in the life of Joseph in the book of Genesis and all throughout the Bible is that he was able to see God apart from maybe his own comfort. You know, he was mistreated not just by his brothers. He was mistreated. He was forgotten while he was in jail. And I think John Corson says it so succinctly when he makes the quote that sometimes the measure of a man or a woman is not according to the strength that they have, but it's according to the power that they have and the choices that they do with that power. And Joseph chose not to bring about retribution on his brothers. In fact, he said, "Am I in the place of God?" And so we know by that statement that he's not in that place of God. And maybe that's a place you and I need to meditate about so we can get there too. Thanks for listening.